Selections from letters. 1. A key in the program of anti-Christianity. To A.Y., August 16th, 29th, 1972. As for evolution, which is a hoax and fraud if ever anything was, we have long wanted to have a good objective expose because of its devastating anti-Christian religious overtones and even foundation, but have never had a chance to go into it ourselves. The statements of Father L, which you quoted on it, sound naive in the extreme. Over a year ago, Father N mentioned he was going to print an article on the subject by Calomiros, but we assumed it would be entirely critical and expose the whole fraud of it. We know of no conceivable watering down or modification of the evolutionary hypothesis which would make it acceptable either to theology, philosophy, or science. Certainly the more sophisticated scientists today no longer take it seriously and recognize that it became popular solely by an act of faith and highly rigged evidence. Well, I think it's beyond us to start interfering with other fellow Orthodox publications and argue over what we think they should print, unless, of course, we have some facts or information they don't have, or unless they ask us to give our opinion. But surely we have the right to accept or reject what they do say, and even, if we feel it is necessary, to publish something that contradicts it, without, of course, publicly fighting with them. I guess we'll just have to wait and see. There's usually more noise than ever comes out of the grapevine into public view. We can't imagine that Father N or Father P would publish anything really pro-evolution, but even a vague middle-of-the-road article would be harmful enough in view of the fact that evolution seems to be such a key in the whole program of anti-Christianity. 2. Theistic Evolution. To A.Y., January 31st, February 13th, 1973. The evolution article for the next issue looks very good to us, quite comprehensive and to the point, and also I don't think there's anything there to which Father P and others could object. I'll tell you what I gathered from them below. However, the article could be improved by expanding a little on several points. 1. At the bottom of page 1 you mention any form of evolution, and at the end of that paragraph you specify atheistic physical evolution or theistic physical evolution or spiritual evolution. However, your article is really addressed almost entirely against atheistic physical evolution and its absurdities, and some people might take advantage of this to say you haven't really considered more refined forms of theistic or spiritual evolution. In such a short article, of course, it's really not possible to go into them. But perhaps a sentence or two more on them will show why they can't be taken seriously either and are not at all more refined, just more vague and confused. Thus, theistic evolution, as I understand its motives, is the invention of men who, being afraid that physical evolution is really scientific, stick God in at various points of the evolutionary process in order not to be left out, in order to conform theology to the latest scientific discoveries. But this kind of artificial thinking is satisfactory only to the most vague and confused minds, for whom, apparently, God supplies the energy and order that can't be explained according to the second law of thermodynamics. It is satisfactory neither for theology nor for science, but just mixes the two realms up. Again, spiritual evolution applies the conclusions of atheistic physical evolution to the spiritual realm and comes to results which are monstrous and unacceptable either from the scientific or the theological point of view. a mix-up and confusion which can only disguise itself in fantastic jargon à la Teilhard de Chardin. Both these kinds of evolution depend entirely on acceptance of physical evolution, and if that is shown to be unsound, they fall. And in addition, they are self-contradictory because the whole purpose and intent of the theory of physical evolution is to find an explanation of the world without God. That is, physical evolution is by its nature atheistic, and it's only ridiculous when theologians run after the latest scientific theory in order not to be left behind by the times. I'm afraid I'm wasting too many words on this point, but you really should tell the reader a little more as to why other kinds of evolution are no more satisfactory. The central point, of course, is that evolution is not at all scientific, but rather a kind of science fiction theology, the product of faith, an atheistic faith, but nonetheless faith. That it is still so widely accepted surely shows how low not only theology, but just plain common sense thinking have fallen today. I still remember my freshman professor of zoology expatiating on the great ideas of man. For him, the greatest idea man ever invented was the idea of evolution, much greater, he believed, than the idea of God. 2. On Piltdown, Packing, Java Man, etc. on page 3. Isn't Piltdown the only one that is universally accepted as a fraud? If so, it would be wisest to emphasize it, citing the book on the subject if you have the reference at hand, and mention the great doubts and questions surrounding the others, so as not to be accused of racing ahead of the evidence. 3. The second law of thermodynamics. You'd better give a brief definition at the beginning. See also the enclosed clipping showing what brought a Soviet scientist to God. 4. You end with a reference to the Gospel of Foolishness, which might inadvertently lead some readers to think that after all you admit that evolution somehow makes sense, and you have to be higher and more spiritual to see that it doesn't. No, on every level, from common sense on up, evolution is nonsense. Behold what a real, unredeemed foolishness they fall into who try to do without God. The article, though short, is excellent, with a very good use of quotes from Darwin and others. Probably you will get lots of discussion on this. Perhaps one day you could put together a longer, more detailed article on evolution with ample citations both from evolutionists, showing their naive faith and sloppy thinking, and their sound critics. I recall a good book I read some years ago by an ornithologist, Douglas Dewar, Difficulties of the Evolutionary Theory, to serve as a reference source for those who care to think seriously on the subject. In general, people are so afraid of challenging scientists on their own ground that they're afraid to get into this subject. A little clear thinking, such as your short article already reveals, can dispel a lot of this fear and the fog that surrounds the question. Father P. mentioned a little the question of evolution. I didn't mention your forthcoming article on the subject. Enough for me to see his basic attitude and fears, I think. His concern about fundamentalism seems to stem from a fear that the orthodox battle against evolutionism might get bogged down on the same level as the supposed scientific arguments for it, and there thus might be endless arguments on fossil evidence, the precise meaning of the 6 days, etc. He is of course right that our orthodox approach to the subject should not be on the scientific, but rather on the theological level. But I also gathered that he is not fully aware of the flimsiness of the scientific evidence in favor of evolutionism, which makes him perhaps overcautious and fearful on the whole subject. Yes, we should keep our basic approach high and theological, but we can also blow up that scientific evidence which just doesn't make sense and which is really the result of blind prejudice and false theologizing in the guise of science. 3. A rival thought pattern to orthodoxy. To Father N., April 5th, 18th, 1973. The most important point regarding evolution. A. First of all, let us shock you right off by saying that we read the article before publication, made many suggestions, which were all incorporated into the article, and fully approved it. And now, rereading it after receiving your letter, we find nothing seriously wrong with it, except that it is much too short and concise. Of course, now with your letter it becomes obvious also that the approach was perhaps too abrupt and direct for many Orthodox readers today, and more preparation of them should perhaps be made. B. Therefore, there is obviously some deep disagreement between your views and ours on this subject. I have always regarded evolution in all its ramifications as an important part of the American modern intellectual baggage which I left behind when I became Orthodox, and it never before occurred to me that any aware Orthodox Christian would regard it as unimportant, especially now when many scientists have abandoned it purely on scientific grounds, when the pseudo-religious presuppositions of its supporters are so evident, and when it is so much bound up with Masonry ecumenism and the whole pseudo-religious modern outlook. We are frankly astonished at your objection to the article, and have been thinking long and hard to try to find your thinking on this subject. Then it occurred to us, apparently you regard modern ideas as being of two types, those that directly attack the Church, which must be confronted and uprooted mercilessly, Masonry ecumenism, and those which do not directly attack the Church and are not directly theological, evolution. Is this true? Nonetheless, I don't see how it can be denied that modern ideas are after all one whole. They are formed first outside the Church, develop in atheist agnostic minds, and then move through the whole of society until they reach the Church, changing form in the meantime to fit in with each current of ideas. Evolution is one such idea, but it's not really an idea, see below, that has not yet directly attacked orthodoxy. But look what it has already done to Roman Catholicism. Is it not true that the whole dissolution of Roman Catholicism in the last decade is directly bound up with the unleashing of Teilhardism, whose books were more or less banned up to then, in that same period, a process which was presented for popular consumption 10 years ago in a rather cheap but symptomatic novel, The Shoes of the Fisherman. By this I do not mean that a certain number of Teilhardian theses were opposed to so many Roman Catholic theses and conquered them. For his evolution is not really a heresy. We will agree that this term applied to him, especially from the Orthodox side, is imprecise, but rather a whole rival thought pattern offering a whole different approach to life, and consequently religion, and being already so much a part of the spirit of the age, its approach was persuasive not by argument, but by fitting in with unconscious attitudes of people who were outwardly Roman Catholic. We were rather surprised when you, and Father E too, as I recall, mentioned that you haven't read Teilhard and weren't familiar with his ideas. That is, you are waiting for the wave to hit orthodoxy before you start thinking of the subject. But really, Teilhardism is the Christianity and Orthodoxy of the future, or rather its metaphysical foundation. It fits very nicely in with charismatic phenomena, and it is by no means too early to find out what is hitting us. Here it may well be that AY's position as a layman in the midst of the world and coming from outside of Orthodoxy, which has already been completely captured by evolutionary spirituality and philosophy, has enabled him to be aware of something that the more sheltered Orthodox, clergy, monks, lifelong Orthodox simply don't see yet. How overjoyed I myself was to find this shelteredness when I became Orthodox, because I saw that in this world to itself I would be able to change completely my mental orientation, not to mention spiritual, and no longer think at all in terms of the reigning despotism of ideas in which evolution has a key place. I did notice, however, that other converts didn't seem to grasp this point, and some of them began to discuss how this or that modern current can be understood or accepted or criticized in terms of orthodoxy, a false outlook, because there are two quite separate mental worlds involved, and the difference is rather greater than that between two totally unrelated languages. We fully agree with AY that evolution is one of the most dangerous concepts that faces the Orthodox Christianity today. Perhaps it is the very key, intellectual, to the assault upon the Church, to the very philosophy, and there is such a thing, of the coming Antichrist. If we understand you and Father E aright, you regard it as merely an idea which one can take or leave, and which can involve one in endless modernist fundamentalist discussions which are totally pointless, how many hours in the first 7 days, etc. We certainly agree on the pointlessness of such discussions, but now the issue is much deeper than that. Evolution is a whole mindset that is quite incompatible with orthodoxy. But that is a treatise in itself. AY's article, as I said, is much too brief, but perhaps it will have the good effect of inspiring a thorough treatment of the subject, not a modernist fundamentalist fight, but also not what Father E apparently wants to do, to stand so far above the issue that one can't even discern that evolution is a crucial question and destructive of orthodoxy, not so much because of its thesis as because of its intellectual spiritual orientation. Significantly, the same mail that brought your letter brought also concern with the article of Theodosius Dobzhansky, who just received a doctorate honoris causa from St. Vladimir's Seminary on evolution, God's method of creation. Well, here are the arguments of an orthodox evolutionist, and they are the same as all other evolutionary arguments, emotional faith with not one shred of genuine evidence to support it, although he presents material that looks very formidable and scientific. But more important, read between the lines and answer. Does this man believe in God as a true Orthodox Christian believes in Him? He does not. He believes in Him as modern man believes. He is a deist, and very revealing is his conclusion. One of the great thinkers of our age, Teilhard de Chardin, wrote the following: Is evolution a theory, a system, or a hypothesis? It is much more. It is a general postulate to which all theories, all hypotheses, all systems must henceforward bow, and which they must satisfy in order to be thinkable and true. Evolution is a light which illuminates all facts, a trajectory which all lines of thought must follow. This is what evolution is. This indeed is Teilhardism, and by all theories and systems he means in particular theology and spirituality, as being part of the highest evolutionary layer, the noosphere, which is just now converging in the evolutionary apex called the Omega Point or Superchrist. I hate to appear fundamentalist, but this mammoth structure rests on just a few little fundamental facts or fabrications which most people seem afraid to get near because they seem so scientific, beginning with the transition of one species into another and so up the ladder. To sum up, whatever weaknesses AY's article on evolution may have, it is an attempt to answer a real problem which we cannot avoid, that ideological orientation and value system which is taught in all public schools as fact and which poisons and stupefies orthodox minds without ever attacking orthodoxy as such. AY's response is sound even if it is not, of course, perfect. We Orthodox are not afraid to be narrow on the question of ecumenism. Why should we be afraid to be narrow on the question of evolution? The two issues, after all, are very closely bound up with each other. 4. A deep-seated primordial force. To AY, April 5th, 18th, 1973. Just a note. We received Monday a rather shocking letter from Father N expressing extreme displeasure with your evolution article. He apparently sent you a letter too, a copy of which he said he was enclosing in his letter to us, but he didn't. After reading his letter, we read your article together once again, and neither of us find anything wrong with it, except that it is much too short and concise. After looking in vain for any other source of Father N's displeasure, we can only conclude that Father N and Father E apparently are just not aware of the whole issue of evolution, whether in its scientific side or in its religious theological implications. Obviously, your article has touched something very deep. Frankly, we are astonished that people so keen on ecclesiastical matters, ecumenism, etc., should seem never to have given much thought to such an important thing as evolution. Apparently, it is because it seems to be outside the church sphere. We must be wise as serpents and gentle as doves in what we do and say now, and by no means must we allow ourselves to be dragged into an argument on modernist fundamentalist lines. Maybe they are modernists, I don't know, but we certainly are not fundamentalists. The truth lies much deeper than either of these merely rational positions, and it will not be easy to present it so that it will be properly understood, judging from Father N's first response. I don't think either you or we should argue at all, but prepare for a more thorough presentation of the whole subject. Frankly, we want to really persuade them, and the way to do that is to go into the subject deeply, especially the spiritual implications. What we must keep in mind and get across, I think, is not really evolution as a heresy or a wrong idea on the same level with other ideas, and therefore go out fighting with the ordinary weapons of polemics. Evolution is not that kind of idea, but rather a kind of deep-seated primordial force which seems to capture people quite apart from their conscious attitudes and reasoning. There's a good reason for that. It's been drilled into everyone from the cradle, and therefore is very hard to bring out and look at rationally. It's a rival thought pattern to orthodoxy, not just another idea. Your article, beyond any doubt, is going to make you unpopular in places. Do not let this discourage you or force you into a defensive posture. Your article is probably going to do something very painful at first, but ultimately positive. bring out into the open some attitudes which have long been hiding in the shadows. 5. The argument against evolution is not scientific but theological. To Father N., Palm Sunday, April 9th, 22nd, 1973. By the way, in case I didn't make it clear in my last letter, the argument against the supposed scientific theory of evolution is not itself scientific, for science itself can neither prove nor disprove it, for science is only guesswork. The argument against it is theological, that it involves implications which are entirely unacceptable for orthodoxy, and these implications can't be escaped, and every propounder of evolution uses them, the theists and spiritualists being worse than the atheists. 6. The real intellectual problems of today. To A.Y., June 29th, July 12th, 1973. We received Father E.'s open letter today, together with your note. Yes, we found too that he completely missed the point, and all the very nice quotes from the Fathers on the different degrees of knowledge mean nothing when one stops to realize that you are not at all attacking scientific knowledge, but only pseudo-scientific, pseudo-religious philosophy masquerading as science, and you are using scientific knowledge not to defend theology, but only to destroy the self-contradictory theories of the pseudo-scientists. Are these points really so difficult to understand or impossible to defend? Unless we are crazy, Father E. has gone off somewhere in the clouds and is not at all in contact with what is going on in the world today, intellectually, which is very much of concern to Orthodox Christians who live in this world. Father E., in trying to stand so far above the whole question, does not give the impression that he speaks from the heights of the third degree of knowledge, which seems to be what he is trying to hint at, but rather uses this exalted knowledge for rather rationalistic purposes. We are very disappointed to see such narrowness, and the reply of the mother to the Orthodox high school youth, this apparently sums up his answer to the whole problem of evolution. How naive and spineless. Footnote: Father E. had written that if an Orthodox youth comes home from school telling his mother that he learned that man evolved from a lower species, the mother's best reply would be, "My boy, God could have created us by any manner he wished, and no one will ever be able to explain or comprehend his ways. All we can do is thank him for creating us." End of footnote. Can Father E. really be so unaware of the anti-Christian purposes of such scientific education? His reply is an open invitation to the youth to accept whatever the school teaches him, because we poor Orthodox Christians, alas, having such high knowledge, can't know any better. I'll tell you frankly, but don't quote me, this isn't theology. It's hogwash. There's a real and pressing problem here, and you've attacked it honestly, freshly, and well, considering the short space you had. If there are deficiencies or mistakes in what you've said, they can be talked about in a friendly manner. But alas, his only aim is to discredit you and put you in your place. This is wrong and sick. Forgive my strong language. After reading Father E.'s epistle, we begin to despair about the Greek wisdom of our own day, which seems to have all too much in common with the ancient variety. What will happen when they really begin to find out how simple and unconcerned about all those things that excite them we Russians are? One basic element seems lacking in all their wisdom, one which the Holy Fathers emphasize is essential for genuine Orthodox life: suffering. The wisdom born of leisure and idle disputes is not worth having, but the wisdom born of deep suffering, such as God has given above all to the Russians in our day, is alone truly balanced and sound, even if it cannot give a glib answer to every mocking question. Let us try to enter more deeply into this suffering, God giving us His grace to do so. Any reply you make to Father E should be brief and to the point. He has obviously taken unfair advantage of you in order thoroughly to discredit you, based on the reputation of the monastery as against you, a nobody. He is riding on a current of intellectual fashion, and this will pass, and it will not be for the good of the monastery that it has allowed itself to do this and not face the real intellectual problems of the day. It will not be easy to get the point of your longer study on evolution across to people who think like Father E, but with God's help it can be done. There is something deep and important here, a rather academic approach to theology that does not come to grips with the anti-theology of our day. 7. Such theology we do not need. To A.Y., July 4th, 17th, 1973. Just a note. Father E's letter has sunk in a little deeper, and it makes us even more disturbed than at first. This is not an answer to anything, and is a disservice to English-speaking Orthodox Christians. Such theology we do not need. We thought of writing a note to him ourselves, but there is no point, since he already has read our letters to Father N, defending you and speaking of the need for all of us to get rid of our American modern intellectual baggage, evolution, etc. Without entering into a public debate with him, we should by all means try to present sound Orthodox views on those points where he is obviously off the beam. Your evolution booklet will be very important from this point of view, and we are writing out a number of points which we hope to see treated or mentioned there, and also some suggestions on how to avoid being placed into certain stereotyped categories by which people can be persuaded not even to listen to what you say. Do you have a general outline of the article yet? We've written Dr. Calomiros a letter and hope to receive confirmation of our suspicion that he is quite wrongly used as virtually a proponent of evolution. 8. A product of the spirit of the times. To Father N, August 19th, September 1st, 1973. Thank you for your new letter. On evolution, what can we say in reply? We will tell you just what we think. The article on exetastes, which is Greek for evolution, by no means is an objective Orthodox presentation on evolution. It is rather a simple-minded liberal presentation, in no way different from what any Protestant or Catholic magazine might publish, and is exactly what one would expect of the Greek Archdiocese, in harmony with its general liberal orientation. The article does not even raise the most serious questions which evolution poses, much less answer them. It is an absolutely typical product of the spirit of the times. Apparently, you think rather differently. But, Father, let there be peace among us. Evolution is an extremely complicated question, all aspects of it considered, and not one of us is in a position to know all about it and give a definitive judgment on all its aspects. Calling it a heresy, of course, is a great simplification, for it is much more complex than that, and it is evident that different people have quite different things in mind when they hear the word evolution, which complicates matters even more. A.Y.'s article was intended not for theologians, but for simple people, and therefore its tone and presentation are admittedly somewhat simplistic and sharp. There are disadvantages to this, the first of which is that it obviously didn't say anything to you, and apparently others of a similar outlook. Obviously, for such people, a much more thorough presentation should be made, and I think this would make it much easier for you to see how inadequate the Exetastes article is, as we think. If you had read the grotesque, satanic theology of Teilhard de Chardin, you would certainly get a funny feeling from an article in which he is held up as an example of a reasonable approach to this question. 9. Looking forward with an open mind. To A.Y., September 8th, 21st, 1973. Yesterday we finally received a reply from Alexander Kalomiros to our letter, inquiring as to his views on evolution, and he promises soon to send a detailed reply in English, with quotes from the Holy Fathers. We look forward to this with open mind and some expectation. 10. Quibbling over words. To A.Y., week of November 6th, 1973. Concerning evolution, Father E. is quibbling over words because he simply does not understand the whole question. He obviously misunderstands both Saint Nectarios, who certainly is not trying to make a scientific statement, but is only, quite properly, ridiculing the pseudoscientists who find man's origins in the ape kingdom, and Saint Basil, who is scientifically correct in his statement on pines and oaks, and he certainly did not intend to say that the seed of one produces the other, since the whole Hexameron emphasizes that each kind of creature reproduces only according to its kind. But it is futile to make an answer to these points. Rather, the whole discussion must be placed in a different, more serious context. Hopefully, this will be what your future article on evolution will do, whenever God wills. 11. The Holy Fathers as the answer to medieval scholasticism. To A.Y., January 9th, 22nd, 1974. Interestingly, just before receiving your letter, I was reading and thinking about Komyakov's close friend Kirievsky, who thought very similarly and is even better because of his close connection with Optina and the Holy Fathers. Kirievsky's thoughts on the difference between the Catholic Western mentality and Orthodoxy might well serve as an article or pamphlet also, which would be very instructive, especially for converts today. The answer to medieval scholasticism, he says, is the great Orthodox fathers who lived at the same time, namely Saint Simeon the New Theologian, Saint Gregory the Sionite, Saint Gregory Palamas. And speaking of this contrast, my research into the fathers concerning evolution has turned up something remarkable. The Catholic and Orthodox doctrines of Adam and creation are significantly different, and evolution can be fitted rather nicely precisely into the Catholic doctrine, but not at all into the Orthodox. This point can be made pretty well by comparing several passages of the Summa Theologica of Thomas Aquinas. I always wondered why I kept that book, with a passage from Saint Simeon which you have, and another from Saint Gregory the Sionite. The whole discussion of evolution, if it is presented just right, can be very important for giving our genuine Orthodox outlook on contemporary science and wisdom. I I've also found commentaries on Genesis by Saint Ephrem the Syrian and Saint John Chrysostom, and some more isolated statements in other fathers. There can be no doubt at all how the fathers understood Genesis, quite literally. I was at first a little uncertain about a quote from Saint Gregory the Theologian, showing that he regarded the tree of the knowledge of good and evil as a symbol. And some fathers, such as Saint Gregory of Nyssa, are full of such symbols, leading a scholar like Florovsky to ask, does he understand the account of creation as entirely symbolic or not? And then, to resolve my uncertainty, leafing through a French translation we have of Saint Gregory Palamas, I found that, in opposing those who say that the uncreated light of Mount Tabor is only a symbol, he cites the very passage from Saint Gregory the Theologian about the tree of knowledge, and says that, of course, he also accepted it as having an existence of its own. All of these quotes put together should do much to give our Orthodox people the sound Orthodox approach to Genesis and creation, which I think many are now afraid of due to the prestige of science. 12. Scientific Fate. To A.Y., January 24th, February 6, 1974. Here are some more notes on evolution, specifically your chapters which we are returning herewith. Presumably, your conclusion at the end of this chapter on the popular science textbook Early Man will not be evolution is proved false and special creation true, but rather evolution, presented popularly as fact and truth, has no coercive scientific evidence whatever to support it. All the supposed proofs of evolution can equally be used to prove another theory depending on your presuppositions. Here you should set down in summary form all the major proofs of evolution, preferably quoting some major evolution textbook, or perhaps Encyclopedia Britannica, the 11th edition, lists 8 evidences, showing that they presuppose a whole philosophy of nature which is not at all derived from proofs but from the intellectual climate of the age. Here you should also have some quotes from evolutionists themselves showing how they realize that there is no actual coercive proof of evolution, but that it makes more sense, or the alternative is unthinkable, that is, God's creation, or other similar quotes. And when you thus quote evolutionists against themselves, as it were, you should be careful not to pounce on them and say, aha, they disprove themselves, but rather continue in a serene tone, not taking maximum advantage of their admissions, because you are going to let all their self-incriminating evidence speak for itself until it piles up and at the end becomes absolutely self-evident, and then your own summation of this evidence will be very powerful. And then here is where you should give the intellectual context of evolution. It is too much for most readers to understand the whole movement of humanism, etc., besides which they are still not disposed to think you are giving them the real story about it. It would be good to quote an authoritative, objective source at this point, so enclosed find 5 pages of quotes from a good textbook on modern intellectual history. The book is by John Herman Randall Jr., The Making of the Modern Mind, a survey of the intellectual background of the present age. The author is himself modern and believes in evolution, and so does not have your prejudices. Yet he is quite precise and aware on the whole. These excerpts show accurately the change from the Newtonian mechanistic universe to the evolutionary universe of our times. Some quotes like these, perhaps with a few comments in between, may be all you need to establish the intellectual climate in which evolution developed. Now you are ready to enter the area of philosophy and theology, for the lack of strict scientific proof of evolution means that these questions basically are not scientific but come from faith. At the same time, you disengage yourself from the dead end of trying to disprove evolution. By science, it can be neither proved nor disproved. It is a question of a different order than science. I don't know what or how much you planned to write on Orthodox evolutionists and Teilhard, but I think it might be possible to combine them in a single chapter called Christian Evolutionism. Rather in the same way that, in our charismatic article, we combined testimony from Protestant, Catholic and Orthodox charismatics, both because the testimony of all groups reinforce each other and because there is really no difference between them. So also, Orthodox evolutionism is exactly the same as Catholic evolutionism. This also would give more punch to the section which I am compiling to follow the patristic quotes, and which might be called effectively, I hope, Latin Scholasticism, the theological foundation of Christian evolutionism. In such a chapter on Christian evolutionism, a basic thing to show will be that adding God to evolution does not at all change its basic philosophical, theological outlook and intent. God becomes a deus ex machina for saving evolution when the absurdity of believing in it without God as a pure chance process becomes too evident. Thus, quoting Dobzhansky and others, you can show how they believe in the same naturalistic universe without God's interference as do the atheistic evolutionists, the denial of God's providence, etc. As the climax to this section, Teilhard de Chardin is extremely symptomatic of the spirit of the age. A religious thinker has come into fashion, favored even by Julian Huxley and the Soviet Union. I'll send some material from Russia on Teilhard. You might look at Le Comte de Noailles also, since the Greek Archdiocese article mentions him together with Teilhard de Chardin. An important part of this Christian evolutionism chapter, quote Teilhard de Chardin, the passage quoted by Dobzhansky at the end of his article, on evolution as absolutely universal. By this time, the mere quoting of this passage will already show the reader how much such a view is dependent on simply absorbing the spirit of the times. This quote shows the blind faith of some religious figures in the latest current of scientific faith, and it offers an exact parallel to the blind faith of Alexander Pope in a different scientific faith, his adoration of Newton and his mechanical deist universe of perfect order, which was mocked a century later by Voltaire in Candide, a satire on the best of all possible worlds. The phrase is Leibniz, but it sums up the fate of the whole 17th to early 18th century philosophical establishment. Alexander Pope, Essay on Man. All are but parts of one stupendous whole, whose body nature is, and God the soul. All nature is but art, unknown to thee, all chance, direction, which thou canst not see, all discord, harmony not understood, all partial evil, universal good, and spite of pride, in erring reason's spite, one truth is clear, whatever is right. And in another place in Pope's works, nature and nature's laws lay hid in night, God said, let Newton be, and all was light. Voltaire mocked this philosophy because it had become out of date, and thus your reader is warned, the suggestion is made. Maybe evolution too is such a passing fate that will become out of date one day, or is already becoming so. And this inevitably happens if Christian philosophy accepts the philosophy of the spirit of the age, which comes and goes. In general, it will be a good idea to contrast the Newtonian universe with the evolutionary. This contrast will give the reader probably all the intellectual context of evolution he needs, and in a very painless way, without forcing him to understand the whole history of modern thought. Many people simply aren't aware that there has ever been a science that wasn't evolutionary, and the contrast between Newton and evolution shows how one scientific theory gives way to the next. Thus, you will undermine the scientific faith of your readers. In our theological section, we will also be quoting Saint Basil the Great and Father Michael Pomazansky on this subject. The climax of the whole article will then be in presenting the Orthodox theology of creation, Adam, which is totally independent of all scientific fashions. For Orthodoxy does not follow the philosophy of the age, because it has its own philosophy based on revelation. The Holy Fathers have a complete theology of the origin of man and creation, which is not bound up with any intellectual fashion that passes away. This doctrine is not modified with every passing philosophy, is not bound up with either the static universe of perfect harmony of Newton, which departed from orthodoxy by making the universe purely naturalistic, and evolution is actually just the present philosophy of the naturalized universe divorced from God and his action, nor with the developing universe of Teilhard de Chardin and other fashionable thinkers today. Our philosophy is not of this world, and it is the answer to the vain speculations of modern men. Above all, the whole study should be as simple and as much to the point and as objective as possible. If one accepts the principle of objectivity and believes in the Holy Fathers, then the whole study, even in a very low key, should gradually build itself up to a devastating and convincing conclusion. By the way, in your scientific chapters, I hope you have a good account of the carbon dating system and whatever evidence there is for millions of years. Also, you must be prepared for answers in several points of the history of mankind. How do you explain Neanderthal man, for example? We've received Father Ann's newest comments on evolution, where he tries to identify anti-evolutionism with the sectarian fringe. Why such pointless comments? One senses that he somehow feels unsafe on evolution, is somehow threatened by anti-evolutionism. Actually, he only confuses more those people who are already uncertain enough what to believe about evolution. And then, yesterday, we received from the Zion Orthodox Hermitage a copy of the letter to Father Ann, which you had already showed us, together with an article which we hadn't seen, called The Creation Narrative. Seeing the quote from Saint Hippolytus on page 1, we looked forward to some patristic documentation. But alas, the author doesn't come through with this, and he turns out to be quite vague on the whole subject himself. In the next to last paragraph of page 2, he quite loses himself in wild speculations which are not only unscriptural. I've never heard of anyone who threw dinosaurs in before the 6 days of creation, but are also doctrinally unsound. The suggestion that there could have been evil in the visible creation before Adam's transgression. In a word, the author is quite naive, and in his fear that science might be right about the millions of years, he already has quite a lot in common with many present-day evolutionists. 13. At last the real battle begins. To AY, February 25th, March 10th, 1974. We received yesterday the long-awaited epistle of Dr. Calomiros on evolution, 40 pages long. I must confess that it is shocking beyond our expectations, giving the evolutionary teaching quite unadorned and unqualified, complete with the evolved beast Adam, and he who denies evolution denies the sacred scriptures. In a way, however, we are rather glad of this, because now for the first time we have found a reputable Orthodox evolutionist who is willing to be quite frank about matters which others, I believe, are afraid to speak up about for fear of offending weak consciences which are under Western influences. I have written him a short letter saying I wish to make a long and detailed reply to him and to start a dialogue with him on this subject. I believe that if we can answer him point by point and raise the points he doesn't mention, we can make the forthcoming publication a very powerful one. I must confess to being rather disappointed in the tone of his letter, which is somewhat in the elevated tone of Father E., with repeated comments about Western rationalists, etc. However, he ends very nicely and begs us to tell him where he is wrong, so we must do this. Frankly, I would like to convert him completely, but God only knows what is possible and how much his mind is still open. The most encouraging thing is that he, like us, regards the matter as extremely important, as opposed to those who think it's unimportant and that everyone can believe as he wishes. With Dr. Calomiros at last the real battle begins. You can read the letter on your next visit. I am beginning now on my reply to it, but in general this is my feeling about it. Father Hermann hasn't read it yet. 1. Practically it is very weak. Very few fathers are quoted, and the only really evolutionary quote is a passage from St. Gregory of Nyssa, a passage which I noted a few weeks ago, by the way, and thought at the time, I'd better use this and explain it, because one who already believes in evolution will be sure to think it proves evolution. It does not, of course. It is merely a general statement of the orderly progression of God's creation from the lowest to the highest, with the most perfect creature, man, coming last. Nothing is said about man or any creature evolving, and in another part of the same book, on the making of man, St. Gregory says explicitly that Adam was ungenerated, but was created directly by Christ. 2. There is a long theological discourse on man's nature, which is very partial and one-sided, but will require a solid answer with quotes from Holy Fathers, for evolution, above all, involves a false anthropology, doctrine of man. 3. It is quite obvious that Calomiros has gone to the Fathers already knowing that evolution is a fact. He obviously has not given deep thought to examining the presuppositions of the fact of evolution, so we will have to challenge him to start thinking and not bring to the Holy Fathers his preconceptions based on modern Western wisdom. 4. He is very imprecise on the very meaning of the word evolution. He thinks that development from embryo to mature man is evolution, and that the existence of different races of men is due to evolution. Very naive. 5. The man is not a theologian, but reads the Fathers by hit and miss.